Today's talk, as I said, is titled 28 Artists and Two Saints. We borrowed the name for our talk from the title of the newest book by Joan Acocella. And Joan Acocella is the staff writer at The New Yorker, where she covers dance and books. Among other books besides this newest book, 28 Artists and Two Saints, she is the author of Mark Morris, a book that is still in print, which is an unheard of thing for dance books, and as well as she edited the Diary of Vaslav Nijinsky and is author of Willa Cather and the Politics of Criticism. Thank you so much for being here today. I want to talk a little bit about how you got to where you are today, going a little farther back than perhaps you anticipated. But I'm wondering if you could talk about how you trained yourself to look at dance. Before becoming a full-time dance writer, you were in training as an academic. You got a PhD in comparative literature, writing about the ballet russe. So could you talk a little bit about why comparative literature, and what did they think about you writing about dance in a comp-lit department?
I'll try to make this a short story. But yes, I did mean to grow up to be a college teacher, and to write about literature, teach literature. And I had and although, my mother took me to the ballet. I grew up in Oakland. My mother took me to the San Francisco Ballet. And of course I took a lot of ballet, but not with any intention of being a ballet dancer. It was just, yes, all right. Is this better? Okay. I just took ballet lessons because that's what middle-class girls did. Your mother was trying to improve your deportment. And, what happened was actually, something, it's like falling in love. I had finished my coursework and my orals, and I was supposed to be writing my dissertation, but because I needed money, I was editing textbooks at Random House. And one day, the girl in the next cubicle said to me that she was at New York City Ballet last night. And I said, Janet, how can you afford to go to New York City Ballet? You make the same amount that I do. And she said, if you give $50 to the New York City Ballet Guild, you can sell, posters and books at the gift bar and get into the ballet free. And at that moment, my life changed. I went on working at Random House for a long time. What happened was I started going to New York City Ballet a great deal. And this was about 1974 or 75. So Balanchine was still healthy, and the company was quite healthy. Suzanne Farrell came back. It was a wonderful company, and those years changed my life. If I had gone on with comparative literature, it was a time when there were no jobs anyway, but of course I would have had to move out of New York. And because of the ballet and various things, my husband and I just felt, we just couldn't bear to leave, and all I wanted to write about was dance. Now, comp-lit departments pride themselves on being more broad-minded and more intellectually serious than French departments or English departments, and they see themselves as history of ideas departments. So I talked them into my husband, who was a practical person, said, you've come this far, you can't not write your dissertation. Even if you mean to be a dance critic, which is what I was thinking of, it will help you to have a PhD. You can't walk out of it now. And so I persuaded my department, and they were quite reluctant, but they wanted to get rid of me because it had been so many years. I persuaded them to accept a dissertation on the effect of the ballet russe, Diaghilev's ballet russe, on the intellectual community in Paris and London. So as long as I was writing about an intellectual community, I was writing about Cocteau, I was writing about Proust, and Ezra Pound, and so forth. They accepted that, and I wrote this dissertation. And from then on, I have taught dance history, but I've never taught literature since.
Could you say something about then how writing about literature is in some ways easier than writing about dance because you're not having to do that kind of translation from a movement into words. So how did you train yourself to write about movement then?
I really don't know. There was no one to teach me, And I have to say that in my generation, none of us, almost none of us, was trained in dance or theater history. None of us was trained to be a dance critic. The ones 5 years younger than I am were. But when I came out of school, the only graduate programs in dance history were York University in Ontario, Irvine in California, NYU, and I think that's it. Now there are a few more, but this is something that was not taught in the universities, not to speak of at the undergraduate level. It was dance was taught, but in the phys ed department, and I don't even know if you got credit for it. And it was considered, and only for girls most of the time, which is why Jacob's Pillow is so important. I had no training. Do you know what I did? I did what most people do when they're in a fix is I copied, fake it till you make it. I read Edwin Denby and Arlene Croce, and I just copied them. I tried to.
I'm sure people know these names. Edwin Denby, one of the premier dance writers in the United States, and an irreplaceable dance treasure, as named so by the Dance Heritage Coalition, and Arlene Croce, who was your predecessor at the New Yorker.
And Denby was the one who, during the war, took over for Walter Terry at the New York Herald Tribune. So he did a very different job. It's very interesting to watch him as opposed to her. She had, as I do, maybe a week to write her piece. Denby wrote on the night, as they say. He walked out of the theater, walked down to the Herald Tribune, and filed by 11 o'clock. So, those people are really heroes.
Did you ever do that? You wrote for
yes, I did.
The Village
I did
Voice.
it. No, not for The Voice. The Voice is a weekly. I did it for the Daily News for about 2.5 years. But dance critics today don't file on the night anymore. They file the next day at noon.
The beauty of computers.
Or at least the New York Times. No, it's not computers. You're right. It must have something to do with computers. But when a dance event opens on a Tuesday, we don't see the review until Thursday. In Denby's day, we saw the review on Wednesday
morning.
Yeah.
So you're not having that. Well, before I get into that, let's talk a little bit about replacing Arlene Croce. She was retiring from the New Yorker. Those are some pretty big shoes to fill. Obviously been writing about dance a lot, but how were you? What was that? What was your feeling taking over that job?
I had been writing for the New Yorker for a long time before I took over Arlene Croce's job, so it wasn't.
Didn't feel like as
no, I succeeded to Arlene Croce's job in 98, and I began writing for the New Yorker in 92. So I didn't have the, oh my God, I'm writing for the New Yorker feeling. Or I had that before in 92. I guess my first or second dance review, I guess, certainly I was nervous. It's nerve-wracking just to write to the length that I write. I mean, when you're writing a books piece, which is what I had done before, the length is negotiable and is very often 5,000 or 6,000 words. The dance column is 1,800 words, and that's it. It's 1,800 words.
Could you say something, for maybe not everybody here has tried to write something about why maybe writing shorter is harder than writing longer, why 1,800 words would be more of a challenge than 5,000?
I'm sure everyone understands that. There's a famous quote by E.B. White. He turned in a piece to Harold Ross at the New Yorker and said, I'm sorry this isn't shorter, but I didn't have time. But you know what the answer is, that when something is short, you can't just blab. You have to make up your mind what you really care about. So I remember coming back once from seeing a reconstruction of a Balanchine ballet at Tulsa Ballet. It was called Concierto di Mozart, an old ballet that had been revived. And I was desperately talking to somebody on the telephone, Mindy Aloff, another dance reviewer, and I said, I have only 500 words. And she said, well, when that happens, you get a matchbook, and you get the cover of the matchbook. Try to get one that doesn't have advertising on it, and you write on the cover of the matchbook what it is you care about. It's actually a very good rule. But I now, but still today, even for a long piece, I keep a sheet, a little scratch paper next to me, and at the top it says themes. And by the time I finished reading, or whatever, I have maybe, 10 or 12 things there, and I choose among them.
So that's the most important. She's got a lot to juggle here. So when you're jotting down on that scrap of paper, then you're looking at what are the things that I know have to be in here. What's most important to me?
That's right. When you're writing for a magazine, unless it's like the London Review of Books where they let you go on forever, but if you're writing for the New Yorker, not to speak of a newspaper, you really have to make up your mind what your subject is. It's not necessarily what's the most important thing about the subject, it's what's the most important thing to you. That's what you'll have good ideas about. And that's the only way, really, that you can make a piece,
Could you talk about, it seems like you have quite a bit of freedom in choosing your subjects. I'm sure you negotiate with your editors about who you write about. But what about, how do you approach writing about a literary subject versus a dance subject? Like, so Willa Cather, for example, how is that different than writing about a Balanchine piece?
Well, wait a minute. I hear two questions, which is, how is dance writing different from book? How is dance writing different from book writing, and how do the subjects get chosen? Which one do you want?
I want subjects first.
Well, the dance subjects I always choose. I look at what's coming, and I tell them what I'm going to write about. And they never say boo to me. Because one great thing about dance and the lack of dance education is your editor always thinks she doesn't know what the hell it's all about. And so they think you know. Believe me, if I were writing about movies, there would be much more interference.
That the editors would feel like they knew much more.
The editors would care. The editors would care. But with dance, they sort of leave it up to me. With books, of course, that is absolutely not the case. Because with books, in the New Yorker, there is no sense of covering the waterfront. There are maybe 2 book reviews per week, max. And therefore, you can imagine how many books are published per week. So they're making a choice, sometimes not an eccentric choice, but it's not a choice about what's the big deal this week. It may be a choice about what would be pleasing, what would be fun, what would be good for this writer. But I counted once with this book, which has, 28 artists and 2 saints. So it actually has 31 essays. And actually about half of these suggestions, well, a little less than half, came from my editors. The Twyla Tharp, they are suggestions that will be right up my alley. But they know before I do that the Twyla Tharp book is coming out. Bob Fosse was Tina Brown's idea, my editor at the time, because, and mind you, every single one of these has what we call a hook. In other words, some event is happening, a book is being published, a dance is being done, something is happening that provides the hook.
That makes it a current event.
That's right. Very often you spend very little time on the hook, particularly if the book is bad. I have a piece here on Mary Magdalene, and the book that was the hook was, well, number one, it was only about 120 pages long on Mary Magdalene, but number two, it wasn't very good. But that's still fine. It's still the hook. And then you read everything else that's written on Mary Magdalene and talk about that.
And then the subject was interesting enough to you to go beyond the book.
And normally I don't make up my mind on the phone with the book reviews editor. I say, send me the book, and then I read it and I fuss about it. Sometimes I send it back.
So what's the time between the call, there's this new book on Mary Magdalene we think you might be interested in, and then your deadline? How much time do you have to because one of the things in reading these essays that you'll see is that there's extensive research that goes into them.
Huge.
So you're not doing it on a 1 week deadline.
No. Of course the deadline depends entirely on the publication date of the book. But he has Publishers Weekly and all the catalogs from the publishers. So he knows in January what is going to be published in September. So the lead time for, well, Mary Magdalene, the lead time was probably 6 months. And it was probably 6 months of work, by the way. That's one nice thing about the New Yorker. They will pay you to work for 6 months on an essay that is 6,000 words long. That's rare. That's very, very rare. Joseph Roth, a writer I cared about very much, who I feel doesn't get enough attention. He wrote 16 novels, and I had read only one of them when I proposed that essay, and so I had a lot of work to do. Italo Svevo is the person I was going to write my dissertation on. Him I knew backwards and forwards. Profiles. Some of these things are book reviews, but profiles like Baryshnikov and Suzanne Farrell are a different kind of work. You have to interview, a job which I actually hate. You do it much better than I do, by the way.
Thank you.
Anyway, very long lead time. Joan of Arc, you'd have to have. I mean, no, you could do it, but I know that you guys can tell when you read the New York Times book review. If the review is about a book on, say, Joan of Arc or Mary Magdalene, you can tell how much work she's done. And, a lot of places don't mind. I mean, newspapers very often need something within a week. I wouldn't work. I'm a kind of head scratcher. And
so you want to do all of that? Take that
I
time
want to do
really
all that
mull
time,
over it.
that stuff. Yes.
So do you think that your husband was right in saying finish the dissertation, get the degree? Do you think that helped you, even though you wanted to be a dance writer, that it helped you have access to writing about books, and that people trusted that, okay, we know her dance writing, but let's let her add some other stuff as well? Or
the New Yorker would never have cared in choosing me as a book reviewer whether I had a PhD. Most of the people who write for the New Yorker don't have PhDs.
No, but I mean, I guess more, it's not so much my question, I guess, then about, having the degree in hand, but more that you had already some authority and knowledge about books that they trusted you as a reader. Whereas I think that some people think people who write about dance, that's what they know about, and that's their specific area. So how come you also get to write about books about literature? And
I did start. I did publish scholarly essays before I went into dance. I just wrote an essay on Dante translations that'll be published in 3 weeks. The first essay I ever wrote in my life was on Dante translations in 1974 for Modern Language Quarterly. So, I don't know. Journalism is not. For example, nobody who has a journalism degree does better in a journalistic career than people who don't have a journalism degree, except through contacts. That's what they do in journalism school. They make contacts. But journalism is much more a pragmatic field. Basically, they give you an assignment very often when you're not, undeniably qualified. If you do it and they like it, they give you another assignment. Mm-hmm. It's not, you don't get passed by committees. It's a nice field that way, which is not to say that everyone who does it can do it. But they may have gotten connections in graduate school.
So now to the other part of my complex question before about what do you think there is a difference between dance writing and writing about books?
Oh, huge. Look, in the end, all arts criticism is fundamentally similar in that it's the encounter of one imagination with another imagination. And the first imagination, me, is trying to explain it to an audience, has a specific... the second imagination also has an audience. But you're trying to explain in words what the imaginative experience was of a work of art. So, with literature, you have to do much more reading, but it's still much easier because the art that you're describing is made out of words. The art you're describing is in the same medium as the art you're using, words. Dance is, of course, I don't do a dance about dances. I write about dances. And the problem with dance is that all dance, even dance that makes use of a story, fundamentally all dance is abstract. I mean, the dancer may gesture with her hands. I could put my arm around your shoulders and that would mean something. Most dance is abstract. It doesn't feel as abstract as music because it is done with the human body. And when we look at human bodies, we always have psychological reactions to the body. So it feels human, it feels narrative, but really it's not. So you're writing about an abstract art, and also in dance, you're writing about an art that nobody studied in school. So they don't know how to understand it.
I mean, so the general reader for The New Yorker grew up reading books, took English classes in college, but probably did not take dance history, probably did not take dance technique.
Well, take actually a closer example is music. My colleague Alex Ross can use terms like octaves, melisma. He can depend on certain kinds of knowledge, which I can't. I do much more explaining, and I do much more contextualizing. The music critic doesn't feel that he has to tell you, unless he's going somewhere special, he doesn't feel he has to tell you what Dvorak represents. He can believe that he can trust that you have a certain knowledge of the importance of folk music and nationalism in music of the early 20th century. I can't trust that anyone knows who Ted Shawn was and what he represented. Or forget Shawn, what about Ruth St. Denis? You know, what she represented, which is actually harder to explain. Ted Shawn, I could do superficially in 2 sentences. Ruth St. Denis, to talk about the role of spirituality in the rise of modern dance, the place of exoticism, the idea of India, you know, the idea of the spirit, and how dance, the history of the idea that dance puts you in touch with the spirit, which was very, Ruth St. Denis was crucial in that. All of this needs explaining. In a way, I have much less room to write about art than the music critic because I spend so much time.
So some of your 1,800 words are given over to just sort of information
yes,
before you get to the...
Yeah, but I need to woo more. I have to do more wooing.
Could you say wooing of the audience to
wooing of the readers? I mean, it's no more true in my case than in the case of any other critic that the person who reads what I write is unlikely to have seen what I'm writing about. You probably all read book reviews, and maybe 1 out of 30 or 20 of those books you go and buy the book? No, you're reading basically, it's not Reader's Digest condensed books, but you're reading a summary of what's going on. And also, if you're lucky, you're reading you're reading the writer's art. You're reading actually a story about art that is written by, if the writer is good. So my situation is not different there from the other critics, but my readers know much less about the field, and in truth, have less respect for it, to tell you the truth. Anything that is not an academic subject. No, I'm quite serious. When the church was consolidating in the 4th century AD, a certain number of identifiable people, notably St. Ambrose and St. Augustine, made decisions about what was going to be part of the liturgy, what was going to be part of the service. believe me, you can read in Augustine's Confessions about their trying to decide whether singing would be allowed. Now imagine what the history of Western culture would be if they had understand that the church was the only, almost the only source of high art until the 17th century practically. So what the church does not allow, don't be surprised that there's no graduate program at Columbia in 2007. But what dance, as you probably know from going to school, was absolutely crucial to Greek and Roman theater. And it was a hugely important art and a hugely religious art. But by the time of the 4th century, the religious festivals had so degenerated. And also the church had a problem about the body. So dance was thrown out. And that really is the history of what I was saying to you.
And so why there would not be this legacy of people respecting it as something that you talk about.
Respecting it, studying it, believing that it was a communicator of truth.
In 1992, you wrote an essay for Dance Inc. called What Critics Do, about the role of the dance critic, and you were comparing the role of the dance critic to the role of the movie critic. And that you said you don't read movie criticism in hopes that a movie critic will agree with you, or that you don't, for sort of affirmation. Wow.
I was this nice person, just brought me a glass of wine. And you know, my cough is gone. Is there something I should know? Guillermo sent it to me. Didi, God bless you.
He's over there. Yes.
Thank you. I feel so much better. You don't read a movie critic to find out.
Right, that you don't read a movie critic to say, oh, right, thank goodness this person agrees with me. And this is actually a quote. You say, I want someone whose job it is to think about movies all the time, to tell me how this movie fits into the field. And if it has more of a place in the field, if it has some special grace, what that grace is. And so that this, for you, is the role of the dance critic, that not that you're trying to persuade people, you liked the show and I liked the show and we're on the same page, but that there's some other job that you have as somebody who thinks about dance all the time when writing about dance. So that was 15 years ago that you were thinking about the role of the critic.
I've forgotten. I mean, you know, if you read those, I guess I would know that they were my words. But what I'm trying to do, apart from certain things that all critics secretly do, which is reward and blame, you know, and instruct, but I'm trying to take an art event and relate it to people's lives. It's not that directly psychological. I don't say, you know, this is about how you feel about your mother, but it is. It is. And no one would go to a dance performance. No one would go to anything if it weren't about their lives. Their mothers, well, their lives. Not my no. My mother has limits as a subject, but everybody's mother is of course important. But I mean, you know, you can have a chance tonight to see a program of 4 works, and you know, you sort of know what they're about. You can kind of say to yourself, I mean, I have to say much more specifically what it's about and defend it and give examples. But you know when something is about love or about hatred or the fear of death, or you know it. I mean, of course, it may be very indirect, but I mean, your heart and your morals are definitely engaged. I don't, you know, and even the most austere and seemingly abstract choreographers, such as Merce Cunningham, would not say that it's not about life. They would say, I think he would say, the archivist of the Merce Cunningham Foundation is here. David, he would say that it was just indirectly, or yes, or even directly, exactly. But
but that the way he's going to do it is going to look very different from, his view of how to put life on stage is going to look very different from Mark Morris's view of it.
That's true, but what I'm saying is that audiences can read it. They know. They may think they don't know because they didn't study it in college. So if they listen to the Moonlight Sonata, they think they know what that's about, and they believe themselves. But if they look at a dance, they're less confident of their judgment.
So this brings me to, my next question is, you're extraordinarily passionate about the field of dance, thank God, because you're writing beautifully about it, and that makes my life better. But one of the challenges for people who write about, or who are in the role of critic, is that on the one hand, you want to build an audience for dance. You want people to go. You want the field to survive. We want more and more people to come and see stuff. But then there's also the role of recommending or disrecommending something. And that, so can you talk about the balancing act of, on the one hand, that you want to support the field, on the other hand, that there's work that you really want to...
It's harder if you work for a newspaper. My job is easier because I don't have to write about something if I don't want to. And the balancing act you're talking about, I think I cared about much more 10 years ago. For reasons that I don't really understand, I don't particularly enjoy writing negative reviews anymore. I certainly respect the business of writing negative reviews, and I wrote plenty of them. But I don't know why I'm at a stage in my life. No, I mean, I think I can explain it, although I don't disrespect what I did before. But right now, I don't want to write about anything I don't like, because it takes too much time. It's too hard. For me to be writing, I just canceled a review a week and a half ago. I was tired, but also the main dance event that was going to, what was going to be the main event of the review, I didn't like the show. I'll talk to you later. I did cancel the review, but I will do that. I will do that now, because I feel that it's a waste, not a waste of my time, but that I could spend my time better doing something else.
So you think that's a privilege of your position at the New Yorker that you wouldn't have working
different.
for...
It's different. I mean, if I were the movie critic, and I went to see the Bourne intervention or whatever it's called, and didn't like it, well, I remember about... well, it was before Tina Brown came to the New Yorker, so it's before 92. So say 1990 or something. The Madonna movie came out, a movie called Truth or Dare, which I've always been fond of Madonna, so I was kind of fond of this sort of bad movie. And I knew the New Yorker movie critic, Terry Rafferty, and I said, "Oh, Terry, when are you going to write about this movie?" And he said, "I wouldn't write about that movie if it were the last movie on earth." And believe me, that is not the case at the New Yorker now. A movie as important culturally as a movie about Madonna would be reviewed, no matter what. No, not no matter what, but it would be reviewed. For me, it's very freeing not to have to write about stuff that I don't like.
One of the things I was thinking about that is a pleasure of my job here at Jacob's Pillow is there's people that there's always somebody who wants to talk about dance here, and then I can go and see a show and I can puzzle about it and I can really enjoy something and talk to somebody who really didn't like it, and that we can kind of have those conversations. And so how do you have those conversations with people about, when you're working on, say, the book about Mary Magdalene that you didn't care for, although you were interested in the subject, do you have a good sounding board of people that you get to have that conversation with?
Unfortunately, because I'm in journalism, I am bound by contract not to discuss with anyone what I'm writing about, which is very sad intellectually, because it means, Picasso talked to Braque, and so it would be good for me to be able to talk to people. I am allowed to talk to my agent. And thank God, he's a very smart guy. He's also here. But I'm bound by contract not to discuss that. I certainly will say this to you. Most of my friends by now are dance critics because I'm at the theater about 5 nights a week, and therefore those are the only people I see. It's like going to school. It's recess. At intermission, that's who you talk to. And those become your friends, and all your other friends drop you because you don't have any time to see them. And you think you're a big shot, and so anyway, that's over with. So I spend most of my time with dance critics, and we talk about dance constantly. Not all we talk about, but we talk about dance a lot. And so I have that. But of course, I would have given anything to have someone. I mean, nobody I know wants to talk about Mary Magdalene. They think, Joan of Arc. Okay, she was a soldier, but and a transvestite. But Mary Magdalene. Nobody's interested in that kind of piety, or nobody I know.
So. Could you say that you talked briefly about how, when looking over the essays that are included in this book, how you came to some of the subjects, but do you find that sort of one subject leads you to another, that you are writing about Mary Magdalene and it makes you, even across really disparate fields, that you find things that are similar? Absolutely.
We won't talk about dance here because it's a much smaller field, and in truth I'm interested in most of it. Mm-hmm. But Italo Svevo, who, as I said, was my original dissertation topic, made me much more interested in the Central European novel. And it was out of Italo Svevo and that kind of culture of Germany meeting the South, and the idea of Western civilization, say from the 1890s until the First World War. My interest in Joseph Roth came directly out of, and then I began to get interested in Stefan Zweig. All these people share the same cultural movement, and they are all Jews, which makes a difference to how they felt about the European synthesis and their place in it. Sybil Bedford, a beloved author whom I write about, although she was only 1/4 Jewish, she wrote about Jews in Jews in Berlin. And to me, all of this is very interesting. I also wrote about Primo Levi. You write about one Jew, you get interested in the others,
So, you set out to sort of follow this. It just started to unfold as you read first, and then.
What happens is you start, just in practical terms, you start reading the books, and there are things in it that you get. Listen, I would very much like to write about St. Teresa of Avila. I'm not supposed to be discussing this with you. I'm breaking contract. But only because I wrote about Magdalene and Joan. Mm-hmm. I'm very interested in female saints. Mm-hmm. They are a very interesting crew. I'm interested in visionary experience, but I'm also interested in how you balance visionary experience with administration and activism. So St. Joan in some measure was crucial in ending the 100 Years' War. And she died when she was 19. Mm-hmm. So that's quite an extraordinary thing. St. Teresa of Avila was a very important visionary, but she was also a very important founder of convents and convent administrator. I'm very interested in women.
Which does not make an easy transition for me then to ask you about the Mark Morris biography.
Sure, but go ahead. He's very interested in women too.
So when you wrote the biography, it came out in '93. He was 36 years old.
And a lot of people said to me, how could you write a book on somebody who's 36 years old? It's ridiculous.
I mean, it's very different to write about Joan of Arc, you can contemplate.
She's dead. No, I got a lot of objections to the Mark Morris thing, except, of course, from the publisher, because Mark Morris was an enormously big deal at that time. And so I started this book project in maybe 89. Mark Morris founded his company in 80, and by 89, when he had been in Belgium for 1 year, he was the most talked about choreographer in the United States. So a lot of people objected because they said, look, there's no good critical book on Martha Graham. There's no good critical book on Paul Taylor. None on Twyla Tharp. Why are you writing about this hairy, loud 36-year-old? Wait until he grows up. Maybe he's a flash in the pan. And I said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a book on Martha Graham that had been written when she was 36? Let other people, I mean, we still don't have a critical book on Paul Taylor. Can you imagine? The guy is like 78 or something. And for a very long time, we didn't have critical books on Merce Cunningham. We do now. But that's just a reflection of the poverty of the field. You know what the truth is? The truth is, I'm really an essay writer rather than a book writer. I only write books when there's an emergency. And I considered Willa Cather's situation in the political criticism of the 80s and 90s an emergency, and I wrote about it. I considered the situation of women with the diagnosis of multiple personality disorder an emergency in the 80s and 90s, and I wrote a book about it. I considered Mark Morris an emergency. At that time, modern dance was highly rhetorical, highly political. It was full of text, language, and action and outrage. And here, finally, unexpectedly, it brought tears to your eyes. Here was a dancey guy again. And also a real abstractionist, a person who worked in symbols, a person who, in many ways, restored what we considered the language of modern dance, the language that Ruth St. Denis had been speaking, and Sean. And so this, to me, was an emergency. He also was, I knew, from having interviewed him once or twice for articles, what a wonderful interviewee he was, which is a very important factor that once you think about it, I'm sure you say, oh yes, but you don't think about it beforehand. Some people who are very great genius artists are terrible interviewees. But if your artist is a witty, funny person who likes to talk, they do half the work for you. And Mark Morris, was definitely in that department. So was Mikhail Baryshnikov, whom I've written about. Very witty, intelligent, thoughtful person.
So that book came out in '93. It's out in paperback, but he's done a lot of work since then.
Yes.
So are you going to revise it? Are you going to write?
We don't know. We're thinking about that.
So stay tuned. It sounds like the answer to that one might be. So could you talk about, and when you're looking back over essays to include in this collection, 28 Artists and 2 Saints, revisiting the writings pretty much come from the 27 of them are from the New Yorker, 3 of them are from New York Review of Books. When you started to think about doing this and revisiting some things, did you have the experience that there were things that you loved at the time, but looking back at them thought, oh, this doesn't work anymore?
Yes.
Or that there were things that you thought that you sort of just put in, you had a deadline, you wanted to get the work done, and that they really stood up to time in a different kind of way than you had expected?
Yes. I knew through discussions with my agent, or maybe my editor, Vicki Wilson of Knopf, that we were going to use long essays. In other words, we weren't using and essays that didn't sound too much like reviews. We're gonna. A lot of times I'm ostensibly writing a review, but I end up writing a 7,000-word essay on Stefan Zweig. It may be that that's the introduction that was written as the introduction to a book on Stefan Zweig, but really it's an essay. It should stand alone. That was the idea. So the first time I started doing essays like that for the general public, not for scholars.
For an academic audience.
Exactly. Yeah. Was in 1992, an essay on Nijinsky, who had been an important part of my dissertation. So I have a filing cabinet, and it has all my essays in it. And they go 1992, 1993, and so forth. I just took out all the folders. I took out all the essays that were long, 5,000 or over. Mm-hmm. And then I started to read them. There were maybe 3 of those per year. And I started to read them, and some of them were not as good as I had hoped they were. Mm-hmm. You do your best. Mm-hmm. You do your best, but sometimes, and sometimes it really doesn't have to do with the subject. You may care the world about the subject, but somehow it doesn't always work.
Doesn't always make the best writing.
Exactly. So I threw out, maybe half or 1/3, and also had a maybe pile. Sent the bunch to Vicki Wilson. She threw out a couple more, broke my heart, and took some of the maybe pile and put them in for her own reasons. And I must say, I didn't contest a single one of her decisions.
It's interesting you say that about the Nijinsky essay, because you've included it here. You wrote it before. You wrote the essay before you had a chance to read the diary of Nijinsky, which then you went on to edit. So could you just tell a little bit about that sequence?
Well, I'll tell you guys then a little bit of background. Nijinsky, when he was going insane in 1918 and 1919, wrote a diary. A very sad and mad diary. He was having a schizophrenic break. And his wife, he was then institutionalized and barely spoke again, not to speak of dancing again. But he lived until 1950. He lived another 30 years. At a certain point, his wife, in the 1930s, his wife needed money, and she took the notebooks. There were 4 notebooks. And she got them out, and she took out all the dirty parts, and she took out all the really crazy parts, and she changed the order of every single one of the sentences and made him seem like a holy Russian saint and published it. And it was a very famous book. And by the way, it's still, I'm sure it's probably in the bookstore there. Don't buy it. Her edition is very, very heavily Bowdlerized. We always thought that we knew when the notebooks were sold in 1979 at Sotheby's commissioned a translation, and at that point we found out officially what had always been whispered, which is that the diary we thought, that said the diary of Vaslav Nijinsky was completely distorted. The text was completely distorted. But we thought that we would never see the original edition because the copyright still belonged to the family. The diaries themselves, the notebooks, were sold, but not with the copyright, okay, with no permission to print, okay. That permission was held by the 2 Nijinsky daughters, Maura and Keefe. I don't know what happened in, I guess it was 1990 something or other. A publisher from France, from a French publishing company called Actes Sud, went to see Maura Nijinsky. Keefe Nijinsky was institutionalized at that time and quite ill. I think she had her father's disease. But this French publisher, Christian Lvovsky, went to Maura. I don't know what kind of chocolates he brought, but he came away with the copyright. So he published a French translation of, the notebooks are written in Russian. He published a French translation, and the minute I heard this, I ran to my publisher, Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and said, we have to buy this. And then I got my own translator. We didn't translate from the French to the English, we translated from the original to the English. And And so that edition of the Nijinsky diary, which I hope is also in the bookstore, was published. It's a much more painful document than Romulus' book. Now, the relation to the essay was written in 1992, the hook being the publication of a psychiatric biography of Nijinsky by a man named Peter Ostwald. A very, very good book, actually. This man, who was not only a psychiatrist but also a violinist, so he was an artist as well as a psychiatric specialist, had actually gone, and he was German, and so he could read. He went to the Swiss hospitals and got out the daybooks of all the years. Nijinsky spent 30 years in mental hospitals. And so Peter Ostwald went and got the records. So that we actually found out, without having Nijinsky's wife distort the story for us, how insane he was, what he did, what his circumstances were, what he thought, whether he was still producing anything, and so on and so forth. Ostwald didn't read Russian, but he had a close colleague who did, and he did all the Russian work too. So here came this book. Well, there was no way I wasn't going to review this. It was the first essay I ever wrote for the New Yorker. And at that time, I had not read the diary. Peter Ostwald had read the diary, although he wasn't allowed to quote from it. And I think he made some slightly wrong decisions. But I had a lot of respect for what he did. And so that was that essay. It got, you were saying, does one thing lead to another? I wrote my dissertation on the Diaghilev Company, and I was very concerned about Nijinsky because his case is so mysterious. He only created 4 ballets, and he only had 10 years on the stage, and his career was over when he was 29. So it's a very shocking story, but he has a kind of career that, what you see here, these archives, this show and this text and this wonderful video collection and book collection there was nothing like this before. Nijinsky's career was, essentially he was a legend more than anything. We had nothing on him. We had some still photographs because he was so famous in his lifetime, but of course no film. Of his 4 ballets, only 1 survived, which was Afternoon of a Faun. That Rite of Spring that Joffre did is based on very, very poor evidence. It does not qualify as a reconstruction. There's only 1 ballet. This guy is the most famous dancer who ever lived, and there's a very famous choreographer, most famous dancer who ever lived, and no film. The crucial early modernist ballet choreographer, and 1 ballet. So, for somebody like me who studied in a field where there was evidence, we had evidence. We had books, we had manuscripts where people crossed out things, and we had concordances and dictionaries and histories and, whatever. If you want to know how many times Shakespeare used the word building, you can look in a concordance. You don't have to count it yourself. So here was this guy who had this huge legend, huge, sexy, sort of vulgar legend, and no evidence. So what Peter Ostwald, I would never pass up a chance like that. And then as I said, when the diary was freed, I guess 5 years later, when the copyright was freed, I was in California teaching. I called my editor and said, please, and believe me, I did it for very little money. Also,
I hope that lots of you are hearing this call to become dance researchers, and I second the call. But I want to suggest that often I share the time of asking questions, but evidently today I haven't. So if you have questions for Joan, I'm going to suggest that you ask them informally while she's signing books at the entrance of the barn, and to thank you for sharing your work with us today.